The Calloway and Hargrove wedding was the kind of event that reminded you exactly where you stood in the world. Lydia knew where she stood. She'd known since 7 that morning, when her aunt called to say the dress she'd ordered for the occasion had been accidentally given to someone else, and could she please just wear something appropriate from her own closet? Her own closet. As if she owned anything that belonged in a ballroom with 3 crystal chandeliers and fresh gardenias flown in from Oahu. She wore the navy blue dress she'd bought 3 years ago for a job interview. She'd gotten the job. She tried to remember that. The Hargrove estate sat on 12 acres outside of Providence, and the wedding reception had spilled from the main hall into 2 adjoining rooms, all of them full of people who moved through wealth the way other people moved through air. Without thinking about it, without gratitude, without any awareness that it could be taken from them, Lydia moved through them carefully, the way she moved through everything. Watching where she put her feet, she'd been seated at table 17. She'd checked the seating chart twice because she didn't believe it the first time. Table 17 was near the kitchen entrance, the one with the door that kept swinging open and releasing a gust of hot, onion-scented air every 4 minutes. She'd timed it. Her cousin Margot had placed her there. Lydia knew this the same way she knew most things, not because anyone told her, but because she'd done the math. Margot was the bride. Margot controlled the seating chart. Margot had smiled at Lydia in the receiving line with the particular warmth of someone who has already won and knows it. "You came," Margot had said, squeezing both of Lydia's hands. Her diamond was the size of a pebble, and it caught the light every time she moved. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to make the trip." "It wasn't far," Lydia said. "No, but with everything going on with your father..." Margot lowered her voice as if she were being kind. "We all heard about the business. God, Lydia, it must be so hard." It was hard. Her father's import company had collapsed 6 months ago, under the weight of debts she hadn't known about until the creditors started calling. She'd moved back home at 29 to help him sort through the wreckage, which mostly meant sitting at a second-hand desk, going through 15 years of books that had been kept in a way that could charitably be described as creative. She hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night since February. "We manage," Lydia said. Margot had patted her hand and moved on to the next guest. Now Lydia sat at table 17 with a glass of water she kept refilling from the carafe in the center because she wasn't drinking and she needed something to do with her hands. The man to her left had fallen asleep sometime after the first course. The woman to her right was on her phone. The kitchen door swung open again, and she felt the heat of it against her bare arm, and she thought not for the first time about leaving. She didn't leave. She never left things early. It was a flaw, maybe. The same stubborn streak that kept her sitting with her father's books until 2 in the morning, looking for the error she could feel but couldn't yet see, refusing to admit that some problems didn't have clean solutions. She was looking at the centerpiece. White roses, too many of them, the kind of excess that made her think automatically about cost per stem. When she became aware that the room had shifted. Not loudly. There was no announcement. But Lydia had grown up in a house full of quiet tension, and she knew how a room changed when something dangerous walked into it. She'd learned to read the small signals, the way conversations shortened, the way people's shoulders rose half an inch, the way laughter became more careful. She looked toward the main entrance. The man standing there was not wearing a tuxedo. Everyone else was wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark suit, charcoal gray, and he wore it the way people wore clothes that had been made specifically for their body, not like armor but like a second skin. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men who'd seen enough of the world that it had settled into their face as something more complicated than age. He had a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset at some point. His hands, at his sides, were large and very still. The people nearest the entrance had gone very quiet. One of the groomsmen, Devon Hargrove's younger brother, a loud, red-faced man who'd been telling golf stories all evening, had stopped talking mid-sentence. The man at the entrance didn't seem to notice any of it, or if he noticed, he didn't care. He scanned the room with the slow, methodical attention of someone conducting an inventory, and his eyes moved across the tables with no particular hurry, passing over faces, dismissing them, moving on. Lydia looked back down at her water glass. She heard his name before she understood where it was coming from, a murmur that started at one end of the room and travelled, the way his name apparently travelled wherever he went. Voss! That's Voss! Why is Voss here? She looked up again. He was still standing at the entrance, and he was looking at her, not at the table, at her. Lydia checked to either side on instinct, which she recognized immediately as a stupid thing to do, because the man to her left was still asleep, and the woman to her right was still staring at her phone. There was no one else. He was looking at her. She looked back at him steadily, because she'd long since stopped having the energy to pretend she didn't see things that were plainly in front of her. He started across the room. The walk took him maybe 45 seconds, and it felt like something out of a film she didn't fully understand yet. The crowd parted, not dramatically, not in any way that drew attention, but it parted, the way water moved around a stone, instinctively, without being asked. He didn't stop to greet anyone. A man in his 50s reached out a hand toward him, and Voss nodded once, briefly, and kept walking. Toward table 17, toward her. Lydia sat very still. She was good at sitting still. It was one of the things she'd gotten excellent at since moving back home, the ability to remain completely calm on the outside while her mind ran the numbers at speed. She ran them now. She had never met this man. She was certain of this because she had a good memory for faces, and his was not a face you forgot. He didn't know her. There was no reason, no logical, traceable reason, for him to be walking toward her. He stopped at the edge of her table. Up close, the lines in his face were more visible. He looked tired in the way that powerful men sometimes did, not from lack of sleep, but from the particular exhaustion of capturing too much for too long without ever being allowed to put it down. His eyes were a pale, greyish-green, and they were completely unreadable. "You're not eating," he said. Lydia blinked. "I'm sorry. The salmon's been sitting in front of you for 20 minutes. You haven't touched it." She looked at her plate, then back at him. "I don't eat things I didn't order." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not even close, but some small recognition of something. "You didn't order the salmon? I didn't order anything. I was seated here after the kitchen ran out of the chicken option." She kept her voice flat and factual. "Someone at my table must have ordered too. I received the overflow." He pulled out the empty chair across from her and sat down without asking, without any indication that it had occurred to him to ask. The man, who'd been asleep to her, left jolted awake at the sound of the chair scraping against the marble floor, took one look at who had sat down, and excused himself so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. Voss didn't watch him go. He was looking at Lydia. "You're Harland Quinn's daughter," he said. Her stomach tightened. "Lydia, yes. Your father borrowed money," he said. "From a man who borrowed it from me." The kitchen door swung open, hot air, the smell of onions. Lydia didn't move. "I'm aware my father has debts," she said carefully. $340,000, Voss said, "as of last Tuesday. The number goes up every week because the terms include a compounding penalty clause your father either didn't read or didn't understand." Lydia set down her water glass. "He didn't read it." "No." A pause. "How do you know?" "Because I've read everything else he signed in the last 15 years and he has a pattern. He reads the first page and the last page, and he trusts the handshake. It's how he lost the business." She stopped herself. She didn't know why she was telling him this. "I'm working on the books. I know you are." He said it simply, without elaboration, the way someone said something when the knowing of it wasn't the point. "I've seen them." She stared at him. "How?" "I own the company your father used to audit his accounts in 2019. The file was flagged. Flagged for what? Discrepancies." He folded his hands on the table. They were the hands of someone who had done physical work at some point in his life. The knuckles slightly thickened, a faint scar running along the base of his left thumb. "Your father has had someone skimming for at least 4 years. The debt he owes didn't come from bad business alone. Someone accelerated it." The room was still moving and talking, and the band was playing something from the 90s, and Lydia sat at table 17 with a plate of salmon she hadn't ordered and looked at the man across from her and thought, I already knew this. I just didn't have the confirmation. I've been looking at the Q3 reports from 2021, she said slowly. There's a line item that keeps shifting, labeled as freight adjustment, but the amounts don't match any of the actual shipping invoices. Voss was very still. Which vendor? Coastal Transit Solutions. But I think that's a shell. She paused. I think there are two shells, one for the money in, one for it out again. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way men had looked at her tonight, the brief, assessing glance that moved on quickly, finding nothing worth stopping for. He looked at her the way she looked at a set of books that turned out to be more interesting than expected. Coastal Transit is registered in Delaware, he said. The second entity is in Nevada. You haven't found it yet because the name isn't similar. What's the name? That's not a conversation for this table. He stood, straightened his jacket. He was taller than she'd realized. Come with me. To where? Somewhere the kitchen door doesn't open every 4 minutes. He looked at her plate. Bring the salmon if you want. You should eat something. She didn't bring the salmon. She followed him out of the reception hall and through a side corridor she hadn't known existed, which opened into a smaller room that was set up as some kind of staging area. Folding tables, stacked linens, a laptop no one was using. Voss didn't look at any of it. He moved to the far end of the room where a window looked out over the garden, and he stood with his back to the room in a way that suggested he'd located every exit before she entered. The Nevada entity, he said without preamble, is called RLT Consulting Group. It was incorporated 6 months before your father signed his first loan agreement with the man he borrowed from. Lydia's mind went very still and very fast at the same time, which was what it did when she got close to something. 6 months before, so it was built in anticipation. Yes, which means whoever is running it knew the loan was coming. Which means, Voss said, that the person skimming from your father is the same person who arranged for him to take on the debt. She stood with that for a moment. Outside, through the window, the garden lights were on, and the rose bushes looked silver in the dark. She could hear, faintly, the music from the reception. Something she didn't recognize. Who? She said. I have a name. I need confirmation. He turned from the window and looked at her. I need the original invoices from Coastal Transit. The ones your father's accountant would have filed. Not the copies in the main ledger, the originals. Paper or scanned doesn't matter, but they have to be the source documents. I can find those. How long? She thought about it honestly, the way she always did. Not the answer that sounded good, but the one that was accurate. 3 days if the files are where I think they are. A week if they've been moved. He nodded once, like she'd said something that confirmed something else. When you find them, he said, you bring them to me. Not to your father, not to a lawyer, not to anyone else. To me. And then what? Then I clear the debt. She looked at him. All of it, in exchange for the source documents. She kept her voice level. Which you'll use to identify the person running the shell companies. Yes, and what happens to that person? The expression that crossed his face then was not cruel, exactly. It was more like the look of someone who had spent a long time past the point where questions like that required complicated answers. That, he said, is not your concern. She should have pushed back on that. She was aware that she should have pushed back on that, but she thought about her father, sitting at the kitchen table every morning with his coffee, going through the mail with a hopefulness that broke her heart, because there was never anything good in it, and she thought about the compounding penalty clause that neither of them had known about until it was already running, and she thought about $340,000, and she said, there's a condition. Something in his posture shifted, not visibly, but she could feel it. The way she could feel when a column of numbers didn't quite add up, even before she found the error. Go on, he said. Whoever did this doesn't get a quiet exit. Whatever you do, and I understand I'm not asking for details, it has to be visible enough that my father knows it wasn't his fault. He's been carrying this for years, thinking he just wasn't smart enough. He wasn't the problem. I need him to know that. Voss looked at her for a long time. "You're asking me to make sure an old man can sleep," he said. "Yes." Another pause. She held his gaze and didn't try to fill the silence. She'd learned somewhere in the last 6 months of hard conversations with creditors and lawyers and men who thought that her far's distress was a negotiating tool, that silence was not something you had to fix. "Agreed," he said. She exhaled once, quietly. "Then we have a deal." He moved toward the door and then stopped, one hand resting against the frame, his back still partially to her. "Your cousin's husband," he said. "Devon Hargrove. What about him? He went to school with your father's accountant. They've been in a poker game together every third Thursday for 6 years. He paused. "The accountant's name is on the RLT incorporation papers as a registered agent." Lydia looked at the window, at the garden, at the silver roses. She thought about Margot, squeezing her hands in the receiving line, saying it must be so hard in that carefully warmed voice. She thought about table 17. "That's why I was seated by the kitchen," she said. "Not a question. They needed you visible and small," Voss said. "People who feel small don't look closely at things." He left without saying goodbye. She stood in the staging room for a moment alone, listening to the distant music and the faint clatter of the kitchen through the walls. Then she picked up her phone and started a new note. RLT Consulting Group, Coastal Transit Solutions, incorporation date -6 months. Third Thursday poker game. She was already working. She found the original invoices in 4 days, not 3. They were in a box in her father's storage unit in a folder mislabeled as 2018 Vehicle Maintenance, which told her everything she needed to know about how careful someone had been to make sure they were hard to find, but not impossible. Hard to find meant plausible deniability. Impossible would have meant someone was worried. They hadn't been worried about her. That was their mistake. She drove to the address Voss had given her, a building downtown that looked like an accounting firm, which she appreciated as a kind of dark joke, and she gave the documents to a man at the front desk who did not introduce himself and did not ask her name. He looked at the folder and he said, "Mr. Voss will be in touch," and she drove home. He was in touch 4 days later. She was at her father's desk at 11 at night when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, because she always answered. "The invoices confirmed the second entity," Voss said without greeting. "The individual involved has been identified. The matter is being resolved." "My father," she said, "will receive documentation by the end of the week showing that the debt originated from fraudulent activity and is therefore null. His lawyer will know how to use it." A pause. "The man responsible has already lost the things he cared most about. Your father will be told, specifically and in writing, what was done to him and by whom. He will know it was not his failure." Lydia set down the pen she'd been holding. She hadn't realized she'd been gripping it. "Thank you," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Not a long one, but long enough that she noticed it. "You found them in 4 days," he said. "I said 3 or 7. 4 was the middle. I assumed you were being conservative." "I don't estimate conservatively," she said. "I estimate accurately. There's a difference." Another pause. She had the sense, not quite certain, not provable, but present the way a number felt wrong before she found the error, that he was almost smiling. "My books," he said, "are not in good shape." She was quiet. "I have 3 people working on them, and I still can't tell where a specific amount is going, and it's been going there for 2 years. The 3 people I have are very experienced." "Experienced at what?" she said. "Not at what you do." He said it simply. "Think about whether you want to know more." "I already want to know more," she said. "That's not the question." "What's the question?" She looked at her father's desk, at the stacks of folders she'd organized over the last 6 months, the color-coded tabs, the timeline she'd built on a legal pad that now stretched across 3 pages. The work she'd done in this room, mostly in the middle of the night. Because the middle of the night was when she could think clearly, and there was no one to tell her she was wasting her time. "The question," she said, "is what happens when I find what your 3 experienced people couldn't?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. "Then we renegotiate," he said, "based on what you found and what it's worth. You'll negotiate with me. I negotiated with you tonight, at a wedding reception at a table by the kitchen door." Something in his voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but less like stone and more like something with more than one layer. "I don't make that offer twice, Miss Quinn." Lydia picked up her pen. "Send me the files," she said.